This is Tony and Mike in the morning on WICC 600, sponsored by Selco Heating and Air Conditioning.
All right, good morning once again. We're at 40 degrees. We do have a little bit of sunshine. It's Tony and Mike in the morning at 9:09. And we thank you so much for having a second cup of coffee here with us. Sitting with me here from Koskoff, and Bieder is attorney Bill Bloss. And Bill, it's a pleasure to have you here this morning. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
We're doing okay. Haven't seen you in quite a while. All right, let's get right to it. Let's talk a little bit about the federal criminal justice reform. Now, in the 90s, thousands of drug offenders were sent to prison, but President Trump is now pushing sweeping federal criminal justice reform in what some people are calling a potentially landmark legislation. Can you describe the sentencing policies of the 1990s?
Really what happened in the 1990s with crack in particular was not one of our proudest moments in terms of criminal justice. There was a panic almost in the late 80s and early 90s about how to deal with the crack epidemic. And what Congress decided to do was to treat crack much more differently than any other drug. For example, crack was treated as 100 times more dangerous than powder cocaine. Not with any scientific basis, but it was purely a panic move. And so it wound up somebody caught with 5 grams of crack, which is the equivalent of like 5 sweet and low packets, would get the same sentence as somebody with over a pound of cocaine. Just incomprehensible and not justified, and it wound up sending a lot of people, particularly people of color in urban communities, to prison for extraordinarily long periods.
Wow, my gosh. What is the First Step Act? Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, the First Step Act is something that has been proposed, and this is something that people don't think happens in Washington anymore, but at least has in this circumstance. There's a coalition of Republicans and Democrats that are pushing some of these reforms, treating similar drugs similarly, for example, and also adopting some programs for better rehabilitation. You know, Connecticut has been a leader in trying to reform not only what happens, not only what sending people to prison, but what happens once they get to prison, to try to get better programming, try to get better services, because the point is to try to keep them out once they get out, try to keep them out of trouble. Connecticut's been very good at that. We've reduced our prison population substantially over the last 10 years, but the crime rate hasn't been lower since the 60s. So it's worked. The social scientists who actually said, you know, programming matters, they were right. That's part of what the federal First Step Act is proposing, to try to get people better programming, try to give people incentives to participate in programming by reduction or additional good time from their sentences. So it's really very thoughtful, and it's being pushed by a coalition of progressive Democrats, conservative Republicans, libertarians, and the president.
Now, that's supposed to go to vote between now and January, right?
Well, hopefully.
Yeah.
There is, as there often is in Washington these days, there is a fly in the ointment.
Surprise.
Well, and this is it's a series of flies, actually, and there are progressive Democrats that are opposing the bill. Eric Holder, for example, is opposing the bill on the ground that it doesn't go far enough. And he may be right, if you can argue that he's right, at least. But the Democrats that are pushing the bill, like Hakeem Jeffries, a congressman from New York, is saying, look, you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the better. But there are also conservative Republicans, some law and order Republicans. Mitch McConnell apparently is either tepidly in favor or not in favor of it. And the problem is it's purely up to the Senate Majority Leader about whether it makes it onto the Senate calendar. It's predicted, Ron Paul was quoted as saying it would probably pass with 70 votes in the Senate. If it gets a vote, it may not get a vote. The president needs to call Senator McConnell and say, look, this is something I'd like to do. I'd like to try to do something bipartisan. It's already passed the House by over 360. And that's the kind of support that it gets. It is a rational, reasonable proposal to try to undo some of the harms that were done back in the 90s and to try to encourage people to get help.
All right. We are talking with Bill Bloss, and he is from Koskoff, and Bieder, right down the hallway, actually, here, right in the building, or a couple of floors down, I should say. How might inmates benefit from all of this?
Well, the most important thing it would do is it would give inmates incentives to do programming, to get involved in rehabilitative programs and make them available to inmates depending on their specific needs. In other words, not just warehousing. That's been one of the big complaints about incarceration the mass incarceration that we started to do in the 90s, it was just doing time, and that was it. And with a few exceptions, the kind of programming that was available to people didn't match their needs and didn't do anything to try to reduce the risk that they were going to get involved in trouble when they got out. So one thing would be to encourage participation in rehabilitative services by a small reduction in the amount of good time that they'd be able to get. Another would be to mandate that incarcerated prisoners have to be within 500 miles of their home. I just was appointed in a case involving a guy from East Haven, and he was sentenced. He was doing his sentence in Lompoc, California. There is nowhere in the United States, on the continental United States, that you can be farther from Connecticut than Lompoc, California. And, you know, it makes it impossible for people to see their families, to see their kids, and, you know, it's hard enough. And we understand that there's a component of punishment to keeping people in prison, and that's accepted. But if the goal is to keep them out of trouble once their sentence is done, ruining any chance of a relationship with their families is just not going to help.
If this comes to be, would prisoners who are currently incarcerated, would they get out early?
Some might. Some probably would. Not a massive number. There are only about 150,000 federal prisoners, and really nationally. And this would benefit maybe somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 in a slightly shorter sentence. So this is not a open the gates up and let everybody walk out provision by any stretch of the imagination. It would not apply to violent offenders. It would not apply to terrorist offenders. It really would apply to the low to medium level nonviolent drug offenders.
All right, we're talking with Bill Bloss. He's an attorney. He is with Koskoff, and Bieder. Can you hang around for a minute, Bill?
Absolutely.
Don't go anywhere. Stay right there. We're going to take a break for traffic and weather. That's coming up in just a minute, so keep it here to WICC. We're speaking with Bill Bloss, and Bill is from Koskoff, and Bieder. Bill is an attorney. Bill, I understand that the number of inmates in the federal prison system is just a fraction compared to America's total prison population. Can you explain that? Why is that?
Well, really because the federal courts are courts of limited jurisdiction. Not every crime is a federal crime. Now, almost any drug crime can be a federal crime, but as a practical matter, the feds don't take every case. If you walk over here to the Golden Hill Street Courthouse, you'll see many more drug cases in a particular day than in federal court. So the federal prosecutors, the U.S. Attorney's Office, tries to pick and choose. They try to go after the people that in their view, are the biggest threat to public order, the larger dealers, the more violent dealers, and it's just a wiser use of resources. The state has primary jurisdiction.
Okay, all right. And would all prisoners, regardless of the offense, would they benefit from this bill?
No, they wouldn't. Really only nonviolent offenders and lower-level drug offenders. One of the things that the bill would try to do is to correct some of the disparities and some of the unfairness in the mandatory minimum sentencing laws that Congress has passed. And this is one of the great mysteries to those of us who handle these kinds of cases from time to time. Congress, on the one hand, the president appoints and the Senate confirms a federal judge because of the judge's his or her wisdom and judgment and experience, and we trust them to sentence and do the right thing. Try to take into account everything that a judge might take into account in sentencing, which is a tremendously complicated process. Then on the other hand, so Congress, the President and the Senate give the judges the authority to act reasonably and act rationally. And then on the other hand, Congress takes away the ability of judges to act reasonably and rationally by saying if somebody is caught with a certain amount of drugs, no matter what their circumstances, no matter the reason, no matter anything else, he has to get a minimum sentence. Could be 5 years, could be 10 years, could be 20 years, could be 25 years, could be more. And it's a tremendously frustrating thing, I think, for the judges, too, frankly. I think the judges, I've had more than one judge say, look, I wouldn't give you the sentence I have to give you under the law if I could do something else, but I don't have the authority to. And so this bill would give the sentencing judges more authority to do the right thing. And frankly, this is long overdue. This is something that has been a problem for the last 30 years. And again, a reaction to the to the difficulties in the late 80s and early 90s, where Congress needed to be perceived as doing something. They needed to be tough. And what they did is they wound up being over tough. They wound up creating disincentives to people to rehabilitate, creating just overcrowding the prisons with no punitive or rehabilitative purpose. And it didn't reduce recidivism. It didn't reduce the rate of people getting in trouble. And the social scientists are right. What reduces recidivism for this class of offender, and we're not talking about somebody who's violent. We're not talking about somebody who's done shootings or murders or anything like that. That's totally separate and not covered by this bill. But a low-level offender, we're better off investing the money and giving them job training and mental health training and substance abuse treatment and support once they get out than in just locking them up and saying, okay, you've done your 5 years and now you're free to go. That it just doesn't work.
All right. And in your opinion, the bill, does it address all the problems? I mean, what are some of the issues still pending?
Well, it certainly does not address all of the problems. There are still going to be, there's a tremendous amount of discretion that the Bureau of Prisons would have in terms of what programs to put particular prisoners in. And there's a fear among some progressive Democrats that the Department of Justice, which runs the Bureau of Prisons, under whoever the new Attorney General is going to be, may not be as vigorous in pursuing some of those rehabilitative programs, job training, drug treatment programs. And that's a valid concern. But, again, do you want a bill that's perfect, or do you want a bill that two-thirds of the senators, Democrats and Republicans, three-fourths of the representatives, Democrats and Republicans, and the president all support? Or do you want to hold off to try to get something better? Well, I think most people that would benefit from these programs would say, take what you can get now and then try to do what else you can do later.
Bill Bloss, we have run out of time, but I thank you so very, very much for taking a moment. Very interesting stuff. Is there a website folks can go to if they want more information?
Yeah, you can just do an internet search on First Step Act, and then there is an organization where you can sign up and get information. I think it's firststepact.org, but if you just do an internet search on it, that'll lead you right to their website.
All right, sounds good. Bill, thank you so much for taking the time.
You're welcome.
All right, we've got 9:25. Traffic and weather is coming up.